I love it that we've got these microphones. Like, we feel like crooners. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if people stay to the very end, there might be a duet. I'm not promising anything. We were just saying, we glimpse literally behind the curtain. We met before and we planned this a little bit, and often do that. And we were sort of saying, like, we're both quite used to an event where, one person is a designated chair and we are the person being interviewed, or maybe doing the interview. And it's quite rare to be doing an event where, the two people are kind of on an even setting, and, one person has to at least take the lead in, starting the conversation. So that's what we're doing now. Maybe Jen, let's start with you. We're starting in the obvious place, which is you grew up in Australia, and I think you began your writing career then, or at least have moved towards a writing career while you were there. So maybe you could talk about your journey into art criticism and writing, how you sort of formed the concerns that you're interested in, and how that brought you here to.
Thanks, Juliet. It is quite. It isn't. I've never done this format before, where we're just chatting and we are friends, and so you're basically eavesdropping, which you're very welcome to do. So it's like mere anarchy is unleashed upon the world. As Juliet mentioned, I grew up mainly in Australia, although we travelled a lot with my family, and I went to art school in Canberra. And then I did my MA in painting in Melbourne. And then in the late 90s, I came to London on a 9-month fellowship, and I'm still here. So, I certainly outstayed what I was meant to do. But I think one of the threads that I see among my friends and colleagues as writers is that often writing comes from a place of both certainty, you want to write, but at the same time, deep insecurity in why the hell should anyone be interested in what I have to say, and also, can I write? Am I a writer? So for years I didn't think of myself as a writer because I trained as an artist and I wasn't academic, and I think in Australia I was more of a secret writer because I was mainly a painter, and I didn't think I had the intellectual chops, and it was a time when French theory was very big, and I didn't feel particularly confident with all of that, and I hadn't realised that you could write from literally your own experience and it would be valid, which was just a sign of insecurity on my part, I think. And so when I came to London, and I think a lot of people find this when they move to big cities that they're not from, even though it's terrifying and expensive and you feel lost in the midst of all of this, the anonymity can give you a real confidence, because if you make a fool of yourself, it doesn't matter, because no one cares, and it will be met with deafening silence. So I think it was coming to London and being here and being really excited by London and terrified by it and not knowing what the hell I was going to make of it. That's why I started writing, as a way of thinking through things, because I was having a crisis with my art. So and I think that is still exactly the reason I write now, more than 20 years later. I use it literally to think things through, and because I think I'm more rigorous when I write than when I talk or when I just think to myself. When I'm going for a walk, I might be thinking about nice grey sweaters or something, But when you write, you have to be very clear. So, over to you. What was your journey in becoming a writer? Why did you become a writer, and how did you become a writer?
All right, interesting question. Like a lot of writers, I think, I had a pretty miserable teenage period. I grew up in a town called Hawley in Surrey, which is halfway between London and Brighton, and a lot less than half good as either. So don't go there. There's nothing to see.
Are your parents still there?
They are still there, yeah. They're probably not going to watch the recording, which is maybe just as well. And so, I had a sort of very typical kind of petty bourgeois background, was at the sort of local comprehensive, and you're very much trained there, to just go and get a job. And I always wanted to sort of write and do something creative. I mean, I was in lots of punk bands of what I would describe as like mixed ability in terms of musicianship. And so I had to go at being a musician, but really I think I always wanted to be a writer. And so wrote a lot as a teenager, and I wrote scripts for television and theatre and short stories and poetry, and I was trying to find my voice in all these different kinds of fields. Went to university in Manchester, the early 2000s, did a history degree, but spent a lot of time reading and writing, again, short fiction in particular. And then graduated in 2003 and thought, well, I should probably get a job and go into the real world now. And so I went into the real world, and my hopes hadn't been high, but it really sucked, and it was just dreadful.
What constituted the real world at that point?
3 years working for an insurance firm in Brighton, Legal and General, which I write about a lot in my memoir. They haven't sued, which is probably good because I think they win. But all around these jobs was writing all the time, basically just always organising my life in a way that would give me time and space to write and to read and to think. And I always said to myself, well, I'm a writer or I'm nothing, really. And actually, I mean, the best bit of advice I ever got about writing was in that job. Around about 2006, I was sort of 25 years old. My mental health was through the floor. I was absolutely flat broke. Felt like I've very little to be clinging on to. By that time, I was writing quite a lot for a little film magazine called Film Waves. It's gone now. It's an Arts Council funded experimental film magazine, which when I explained that concept to a friend recently, he said it sounded as distant as the National Coal Board or something. It's another world now. But it wasn't going very well, and a friend of mine at this job just said to me, look, you become a loser when you give up. And so I just sort of kept going, and in the end got a break, which was writing about my transition sort of gender reassignment for the Guardian in 2010 to 12. And that obviously opened a lot more doors for me, and had been quietly honing my craft in Brighton. And a lot of writing is decision making about what type of writing you're going to do. Are you going to be a poet? Are you going to write fiction? Are you going to be a critic? Are you going to be a playwright? Are you going to be some combination of these things or something else entirely? And what are you going to write about? And it just became more and more obvious to me that the thing I needed to write about was trans issues as I lived them and experienced them, and more widely, sort of culturally, politically, historically. I wanted to write about, I don't know, like old Soviet cinema or football or film or whatever, literature. But the thing I needed to write about was trans issues, and that was really where I sort of found myself in much more public writing than what I've been doing before. And really I realised that, that was the thing I was sort of existentially driven by, was wanting to use writing and creativity as a way of like leaving the world in a slightly better place than when I came to it. And also so that, basically people like the teenage me, like growing up in like a boring town with no real community and not much in the way of resources in the public library or whatever, would have a certain source of information on sort of trans and queer and non-binary subjects that I hadn't had. So yeah, that was really what was kind of driving me a lot of the time, I think.
And I think one of the many brilliant things about your writing is that, I've learnt so much from Juliet's writing, because I think that the trans issue is often so divisive now in the way it's written about, that these issues become really monolithic. But one of the extraordinary things in Juliet's writing is not only as her memoir, I found it incredibly moving and informative, because previous to Juliet, I think the main trans memoir was Jan Morris's Conundrum? Yeah. Which was, 40 years earlier. And so to, read about someone roughly my generation who is going through all of this was extremely, illuminating. And then in Juliet's new book, Variations, what came out last year, amazing sort of virtuosic feat, I think, because she takes trans stories from the past, few centuries, 150 years or so, and writes short stories about these invented scenarios from a cross-dresser who tries to go to Twelfth Night, a performance of Twelfth Night in the 19th century, to experiences in the 20th century in club culture or reassignment, or, you know, there are so many different experiences that you're exploring here that I think that you've done exactly what you set out to do in the sense of you have enriched the world, and it's been a force for good, your writing, I think. You know.
Well, that's incredibly kind, thank you. What can I say to that?
All right, I'll ask you a question then.
Yeah,
That's probably easier. Then we've been talking over the last few days, and Juliet said, you know, I was saying, what are you writing now? And Juliet was saying, well, it might be time to put aside focusing on trans issues for other issues. And I was curious to ask you why is it time to move on or move sideways?
Firstly, you've just mentioned how unpleasant the discourse around this subject is and has deliberately been made to be. And it's one of the tactics of the oppressor is to make the discourse as toxic as possible and then blame their opponents for it being toxic. And you can see that in various different fields of sort of UK media and political life, I think. But trans issues are as foremost an example of that tactic being used as any. So partly it's just kind of exhaustion and burnout. And, you know, one of the sort of key features of this sort of culture war approach to an issue is that, you know, the war isn't winnable, and the people pursuing the war know it's not winnable, and the idea is to just kind of bleed, bore and exhaust the enemy into submission, really. And, you know, the energy of, I don't know, multi-millionaire children's authors to pursue this subject when they could be doing almost anything else never ceases to sort of dispirit me. So it's partly just, you know, you kind of let the opposition win if you're just writing purely on their terms. And I don't want to just constantly have to write the same article over and over again saying, here's what so-and-so says about trans issues. They were wrong last week, they're wrong again this week. Here's why, again. You know, that's boring to write and, you know, kind of boring to read. Also, I mean, I think the context I grew up in, you know, the Thatcher passed Section 28, which banned the promotion of homosexuality and in practice, you know, any LGBT issues in schools and public libraries and public spaces, you know, council spaces, publicly run spaces. In 1988, when I was 6, and it was eventually repealed in 2003, just after I graduated from university. So the whole of my education, growing up with that law, and the sort of lack of access to information that was designed to, you know, enforce. A 25-year-old now wouldn't remember life without the internet, wouldn't really remember life without social media. They've grown up in a completely different context. And I've published 3 books dealing with trans issues, in one way or another, a memoir, a collection of short stories, and a collection of journalism. And I just think it might be good to let other younger voices kind of carry that discourse. You know, if people want my opinion on certain subjects, then I will kind of give it, or more likely suggest someone else that they talk to, which is also a, you know, an important kind of role to play. So those are the main reasons, and I just sort of feel that between these 3 books, I've said most of what I have to say about this subject, and you know, there is lots to say about other things, and everything I write will inevitably come from a sort of trans and queer perspective, because how can it not?
Of course, and with your book Frontlines, which is journalism, I mean, that's a testament too to your versatility, because obviously it's not just about trans issues in this, it's also about music and film and cinema and all of these things, which of course you come to from your perspective, but that's not the main focus of what you're exploring in your journalism.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there was a sort of period where I was getting positioned as the transgender journalist, and I found that quite limiting and quite frustrating. It's, you know, in journalism, you do need a niche, really. You do need certain things that editors will think, I need an essay or a piece of writing on this subject. Okay, who shall I call? And, you know, it's good if there are at least some things where that's you, otherwise you're not really going to have a career. But it was quite limiting. It was sort of quite frustrating, and I sort of reached a point a couple of years into my more mainstream journalistic career where it was all I was being asked to do. And so then I was sort of start again, really, in writing about literature and film and music and politics and various other things. I'm interested in football as well, write about quite a lot. But more or less had to go back to the start with all of them and just do more writing about them for free until people noticed. And then obviously found a way to sort of weave these things together and ended up writing more about sort of trans and queer literature or film or music or history or sports even. And sort of found a more kind of unified practice really, and then could branch back out from there. I mean, you commissioned me for freeze plenty of times when you were editing there. And, you know, I mean, I remember you commissioned me to write about Mark Hollis, the singer from Talk Talk, who died a few years ago, various other things, and sometimes there were sort of trans artists, and there's a couple of pieces that do appear in this volume of transjournalism, but often they weren't. And, you know, having that sort of niche and then building back out again was quite a challenge. It took a few years, and, you know, I kind of think of writing, it's almost like a sort of frame of snooker or something where you have to be thinking several shots ahead all of the time, and people can sort of see where the balls are on the table, and they can see the next shot you're taking, but only you have in your mind where you're going next. And I think if you want to evolve as a writer, you do have to be, and especially if you're coming from a kind of minority position where you're likely to get typecast, you do have to be quite thoughtful about what you write and what you publish and what order and which projects you plan and how you kind of frame them in terms of, you know, where they're published and who publishes them and the sort of forms that you use. Because, you know, if you just sort of drift and if you don't take control of that process, then you will just get sort of like swept along on a wave of typecasting. And yeah, not everyone kind of minds that. It's not always a bad thing. But it can be quite constrictive as a writer, and it was really what I wanted to avoid. So yeah.
Would it be a good time for you to read something now? Because we're both going to read something from that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what, because there's quite a range of things I could read here. What do we reckon? A bit of a short story, a bit of the memoir, a bit of journalism. I'm not quite sure what the best thing off the back of that is.
What's your mood? Are you in a...
What is my mood? Depressed.
A sad short story? Or a piece of journalism? I don't know.
Maybe let's have a bit of the short stories.
Actually, if we do that, could you give a brief introduction to what Variations is? I mean, I've sort of explained it, but a bit more from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these stories do engage with art and culture. And actually there's one passage in this story that I think is quite nice and includes a little bit of singing, which you don't get in a lot of readings. So, you know, I hope you guys are going to enjoy it. So now I'm going to read a short passage from Variations, but I think I actually read at the 30th anniversary party for Freeze a year ago, so it feels appropriate to do that. So I'm going to read a short passage from one of the stories in Variations called Standards of Care, to give just a little bit of more of an outline of what Variations is. This is a collection of short stories that broadly tells a history of trans and non-binary people in Britain from the 1840s through to something close to the present. And each story is set in a different decade in a different city and uses a different form of writing, hence the title Variations. They also will have different protagonists, and some of them are transsexual women, some of them are trans men, some of them are kind of genderqueer or non-binary people, and obviously their identities are shaped by what is available to them at the time. And I'm just wondering whether I should read from the seventh story, which is set in the 1970s in Norwich, or from the 1890s story set around the Oscar Wilde trial in London. And basically the 1890s story deals with literature and a trans character, and the 1970s story deals partly with music and a trans character. I'm really not sure, so maybe we
Which is
could
the
put
one
it
with the
to
singing.
the one with the singing. Okay, cool. That's a good one. So we'll read from the 70s story then, which is called Standards of Care, and it's all about a transsexual woman in Norwich who's splitting her time between there and London. And at this point in the story, she's in London. She has come to go to the Charing Cross Gender Identity Clinic, but also a sort of trans support group in London. So I'm going to read a little bit about that. So we got to Upper Street, and it turned out Eleanor did know a couple of people there. Jackie, who she called the old biz who runs it, gave us a slightly cold reception. Eleanor said it's because she's not into transsexuals, even though it was a TVTS support group. But maybe it was nothing to do with Jackie being a transvestite. She just wasn't comfortable with all these young punks showing up with their slash tights and pink hair, effing and jeffing like the Sex Pistols on the Bill Grundy show. Eleanor introduced me to Andrea, who'd apparently entered some mad beauty contest last year, her eyes done up like Susie Sue, fake tits and a Union Jack dress with platform boots, safety pins through her ears like something out of Jubilee, which Eleanor said was a film they'd seen recently with lots of punk people in it. Here, Andrea was more restrained, but still in her fishnets, short skirt and big boots, which I could see Jackie didn't like, although she was far too polite to say anything, just being a bit more cautious and offering Andrea tea and biscuits, although Andrea still watched her P's and Q's. It was funny to see these kids, who the papers are endlessly calling deviants, devil worshippers or red terrorists, listening to their dowdy elders talk about how they were forced to quit their jobs and couldn't face the courts, like me, or how the clinic told them to get divorced so they weren't married to a woman. Rachel made that decision for me, I said, or got given testosterone or sent for electroshock therapy, as if that would magically turn them into happy, functioning men. Eleanor talked a bit about her girlfriend, Anna, called herself a feminist, but completely lost it when she came out as transsexual, saying it didn't make sense that Anna basically hated men, but hated even more that Eleanor wanted to be a woman. Eleanor said she didn't try to save the relationships, but there were quite a lot of people who think like that, but it was the first I'd heard of it. Skip a little bit, so they leave, and Eleanor and Andrea were so brash as they strode back to the tube, taking no shit off anyone. It was hard to keep up in my court shoes. They stuck their fingers up at anyone who looked twice at them, but when some tosser screamed, "You dress like my mum," at me, Andrea just laughed. Eleanor waited for me to catch up, and when I went quiet, told me I either had to shout back at them or take it on the chin. I sighed. She told me that if I let every comment like that bother me, then I'd fall apart. That made me feel a bit better, and then Andrea said, "You do dress like my mum, though." Eleanor smiled and then changed the subject, sharpish, telling me we were going to a secret gig at the Roxy, someone called Wayne County with a backing band called the Electric Chairs who'd been in Jubilee and who, she promised, would make the New York Dolls look like Genesis. Quite the promise, I thought, but I wanted to see if the band would live up to it. I got a bit bored with Johnny-come-latelys advertised in the NME, with try-hard names like Dickie and the Glue Sniffers or the V2 Bombers, with swastikas on their jackets to wind up their parents. What would make this different? A fair bit, it turned out. Wayne came on, holding the microphone far too close to his mouth and snarling, "If you don't want to fuck me, then baby, fuck off." That's your singing, guys. So far, so typical, but I haven't seen anyone who looked like Wayne before. This huge bouffant blonde wig permed down past his or her shoulders, short dress and stilettos. He kept taking the mic stand, hitching up his skirt and sticking up his crotch, pointing at the crowd and screaming at them. I just stood there laughing as the 30 or so people in the crowd started whistling, screaming and pogoing, as Eleanor called it, sweating buckets. I thought I'd get eyeballs for not looking punk enough, but nobody cared. It was so dark I could hardly see anyone except Wayne anyway. For one of the songs, he put on a hat and pulled out a toy gun to take the piss out of the police, crashing into the guitarist as he leapt around the tiny stage. I wasn't crazy about the Electric Chairs racket, a bit rockabilly, a bit punk, and to say they made the New York Dolls look like Genesis was overselling it. But I could have watched Wayne all night. But I only got about 20 minutes before I had to rush back to Liverpool Street, covered in beer. Eleanor said I could have stayed at hers, but her squat mates had a band from Manchester crashing on their sofa. The next day, she phoned to say I'd missed a new song called Man Enough to Be a Woman, which was amazing, all about County's transsexual feeling and dropping the mask of masculinity. And fair enough, it did sound pretty great. Still, I'd seen just enough to make it worth it. The next day, I called into R Price, HMV and Castle Road Records. None of them had ever heard of Wayne County and laughed at me when I tried to explain.
Great. We were talking before how if there's a correspondence between what we do, it's about looking at stories of exclusion, I guess, about, I've focused a lot on women in art and how they've been written out of traditional art histories, and obviously Juliet has been looking at trans histories and bringing them into the sort of limelight. And in terms of where this might lead now, if you want to move on from writing about trans stuff, what do you imagine the next thing you might want to write might be?
I mean, in terms of a big project?
Soviet cinema?
I mean, in terms of a big project, I think it's probably more fiction. I'm kind of enjoying that a lot more. I don't have any big ideas for another non-fiction book at the moment. And I want to write something about London in the 2010s.
Why that decade?
I mean, obviously it's the last decade I've been living in London, but I think it's been a really interesting and intense time to be here. You can trace a kind of history of sort of counterculture and leftist politics that goes through the student protests in 2010, the Occupy movement around St Paul's in 2011, which indeed was there when I moved to London, was very struck by it. A lot of anti-fascist activity in the and anti-austerity activity in the first half of the decade, and then the sort of the Corbyn's Labour very much came out of London, and the experience of inequality in London. I mean, the visibility of inequality in this city just never fails to kind of appall me. And there's a combination of during this last decade, London being turned basically into Dubai on Thames, architecturally. And just the huge, just skyrocketing homeless population. Of course, the Grenfell massacre, quite frankly, of the richest borough in London hosting that disaster, and a disaster that very much came out of a housing policy that was designed to decant people who weren't supposed to be there, and right down to the cladding that caught fire being put on that particular building because it was spoiling the view of the wealthy people who'd subsequently moved to the area. So I think I really do want to try and sort of capture that in fiction experience of living in this city and how exhausting and expensive and intense London has been.
Like a 21st century Charles Dickens, really. To find a story throughout all of that touches on these, many issues around inequality and individuality.
I hadn't thought of it like that, but yeah, I mean...
We're in the right area for Dickens.
We're very much in the right area for Dickens, absolute Dickens. Dickens town, isn't it? Holborn and round here. Yeah, I mean, probably, more kind of modernist sort of inflection. Very interested in a lot of modernist novels about a city in sort of periods of rupture or turmoil. I'm thinking of something like Andre Belly's amazing novel Petersburg about the failed 1905 revolution, or maybe some of John Dos Passos's work, Manhattan Transfer, Bruno Jasienski's novel I Burn Paris, which got him banned from France.
Oh, when was that? I don't know.
1928, I think. But yeah, that's kind of interest to me. But yeah, I'd like to pick up on what you were saying about writing about exclusion. And you have written quite extensively in your book, The Mirror and the Palette. It's all about women's self-portraiture over sort of 500 years. And you use Instagram in a really interesting way. You basically offer a woman artist a day with an image or maybe a handful of images and a sort of extensive description of their work and career, and it's an act of real generosity, I think, in a way that social media has made possible, and of course, one of the nice things about social media is it leaves spaces for other people to comment and say, well, look, okay, here are some other works by this artist are interesting, here are some other women artists in that style or in that milieu. So maybe we could talk a bit about the mirror and the palette, as a sort of, an act of writerly and textual art criticism, and how that intersects with how you use social media and the more sort of almost collective acts of writing. And this is something I'm always really interested in. I think, writing is obviously often seen as this very sort of solo, quite virtuoso, quite mysterious process where, the writer sits in their garret, in their moment of inspiration and just, bursts out, word after word after word until they've produced, some sort of like weird masterpiece. And actually, no, writing I think is a lot about like living in the world and talking to people and sharing ideas and sharing culture with people. So yeah, I'd like to sort of maybe talk about the mirror and the palette and ideas of sort of community and of sharing work.
Yeah. I don't even know how long ago it was now. More than about 8 years ago or something. I started this project on Instagram, which I've actually paused for the moment while I've been finishing my new book. So I haven't posted much recently, but I'm going to reboot it again in the next month or so, I guess. But it developed purely out of an act of self-education because, it's not a new story that women have been essentially excluded from the traditional art histories, like, for example, Gombrich's famous history of art, which was first published in the 50s and then rapidly reproduced. It sold, something like 40 million copies. In the first editions, it didn't include one woman artist. And the fact of the matter is that women have always made art. There's always been, it's been well documented, sometimes not as well documented as it could be, but, there are instances of women making art since, records began. And so this, the more I learned about this, the more infuriating I found it. And of course this extended into the 21st century when exclusions are still very visible around representation, from women to people of colour to around class, around sexuality and gender. I mean, there's huge amounts of exclusion still. And my belief has always been that art is a human activity, and so therefore it should be represented as such. And so I just started the Instagram purely as a way of thinking, I want to find a woman from history who was born today and celebrate her. And so it just sort of grew from that. And then I was sort of amazed to discover that there was something in that people found interesting. And then so much came out of it. I've had so many messages about artists who I never knew about. People would direct message me or, put comments. And as Juliet said, it became a real sort of community. And so it's been a really, no one's ever really mean. It's amazing. This is social media and people are nice. It's weird.
Just say on that though, I think with social media, actually a lot of the time, there's always exceptions, but you mostly get the kind of responses. You set the tone of discussion, the responses come to that. A lot of journalists who, constantly complain that people are mean to them on the internet, will, publish some long op-ed for the Times saying that if immigrants drown in the Channel, that's just that's their fault, or,
right.
Trans children shouldn't be allowed any sort of, support or healthcare, and, if you disagree, you're some horrible, woke liberal, and then wonder why they get loads of responses telling them that they're scumbags. Your project is really generous and really nice and really good-spirited, and that's why you get nice, good-spirited, right. Generous responses. Right. Would you like to read anything from Miriam?
Yeah, actually, I thought I might read something, she said nervously, from my new book, which is coming out in February, and I haven't read it at all yet, so I thought I might read you a little bit of that. And this book came out, this sort of developed from the mirror and the palette, in that I started to become really interested when I was doing research for this on, I'm putting my arm up in a nervous way. Really interested in, again, another alternative history of art, which is, or not an alternative history, it's a history of art that hasn't been properly explored, which is looking at the role of spiritualism in the development of modernism. And also this coincided, this interest in thinking around different ways of being in the world, developed out of when I left Freeze magazine, and I was absolutely exhausted and burnt out after 20 years of going absolutely non-stop and constantly having to have an opinion about something. And I got really tired of having to have an opinion. So, and also I was thinking about, you know, this mad moment that we're in world history. There's something in it that echoes Dada, which developed out of the First World War, and the idea of when the world has gone to shit and governments have approved tens of millions of people being slaughtered, why should we believe in that kind of rationalism and that kind of morality? And so I think that there's been a real turn now to this interest in what I call the other side. And it's another side of art history, and it's also it's the other side of believing how we've long been taught that we should live. So, I mean, it's not particularly dogmatic, it's not encyclopedic, it's a very speculative book, and it came again out of a real sort of my own exploration at this point in my life. So, all right, I haven't read at all from this at all. So this is a bit from my introduction. So I've already set the scene. I've actually run away to Greece, and I'm thinking about goddesses. Anyway, so this is from my prologue. And the book is called The Other Side, A Journey into Women, Art and the Spirit World. To trust in art is to trust in mystery. The suggestion that no serious artist would attempt to communicate with or about the dead or other realms falls apart with the most perfunctory scrutiny. Across the globe, the spirit world has shaped culture for millennia. In the West, the Bible was the source of most pre-modern art, and it's full of magic, the supernatural, and non-human agents. Where would the Renaissance be without its saints, angels, and devils, its visions of humans manipulated by powers beyond their comprehension? Or ancient Greece without its gods and goddesses who shape-shifted at the drop of a hat? Or, for that matter, much pre-modern and First Nations art. But then art itself is a form of alchemy, the transformation of one thing, an idea, a material, into another. It is in its nature to be elusive rather than literal, to deal in association, symbol, and encryption, to honour intuition and imagination over reason. All of this chimes with much magical practice. It's as unconcerned as a prophet with accuracy. Physicists tell us that our reading of time is crude, but artists have always known this. They constantly mine the past even as they're imagining possible futures. How can change, be it new machines or new ideas, be visualized if it can't first be imagined? And who would ever assume that imaginations run along straight lines? Most artists are, in some shape or form, time travelers and ghost whisperers. They have myriad ways of accessing the dead, via the tangible proof of their thinking, books or paintings or music, say, or through more esoteric means, mediumship, intuition, ritual, dreams, call it what you will. Although numerous 19th and early 20th century artists created their pictures via spirit communication, the more I discovered about them, the less I cared about the veracity of their claims about connecting with the dead. The creative act is often mystifying. To pin it down and dissect it is possibly the least interesting and possibly the most futile thing you can do with it. I'm fascinated by the myriad ways in which arcane beliefs have influenced the course of art over the past 150 years or so, and in particular the drawings, paintings, and sculptures made by women. For too long, these works were seen as either fascinating curios or sidelined or omitted from Western art history, despite the clear and documented reality of their existence. Even in art, reason, order, and ambition were considered to be masculine traits. Men were active and intellectual, whereas women were assumed to be passive, fragile, and emotional. Many of the explorations and innovations of artists who happened to be women were seen as eccentric, although in the early days of modernism they often drank from the same spiritual well as their male contemporaries, many of whom were lauded. However, it's not only the omission of female artists from art history that is significant. In the 19th century, some of them were also vocal about women's rights. It's hard not to see a correlation between their criticism of patriarchal power structures and their absence from the male-shaped canon. Sometimes the best way to shut someone up is to ignore them. It's also worth reiterating that finding inspiration from the deep past does not mean avoiding the present. The falsehoods we've been told about women's contributions to the artistic life, for one, dissolve in the face of historical fact. Despite being taught for too long that culture was, in the main, shaped by men, there are well-documented accounts of mythic and historic women who exerted their influence across all spheres. But of course, it's only very recently that women's contribution to art and everything else has been acknowledged. Gender exclusion, including that of queer, trans, or non-binary artists, is just one of numerous omissions. First Nations artists, artists of colour, those who weren't professionally trained or who were differently abled, all were, and in many cases still are, sidelined or ignored. A true story of art should reflect the fact that humans make art, and that what it means to be human is infinitely variable. What is clear is that at a time when women didn't have the vote and were barred in the main from training as professional artists and had to acquiesce to masculine authority on just about everything, spiritualism allowed not only a creative and personal freedom, but a sense of community free of male control and criticism. Anyway, so that's all for now.
I think that serves as a really brilliant summary of your sort of practice and of your set of concerns and your approach. So I don't know if you want to maybe talk a bit more about this forthcoming book and maybe some of the artists that you talk about, and I don't know what's driven this project.
Yeah, well, although what I read then was fairly not so personal, in a way it is personal. The book really did, as I mentioned earlier, it developed out of this sort of almost moment of crisis and exhaustion in my own life. When I stepped down as editor of Frieze in late 2019, early 2020, and so, God, 2 years ago, almost 3, amazing. And it was really scary because I'd been with Frieze for a long time, and I have amazing friends at Frieze. I had an amazing community there. I had a salary, very importantly. And so to step down from all of that, and I really committed. I didn't want to get another job. I just wanted to write full-time. I wanted to be creative full-time. And I wasn't sure if I could do it, like emotionally, physically, financially. So I did the NHS anxiety course.
Wow.
I did. I read lots of self-help books, actually. It was all change is terrifying. But at the same time, you know that it's a change that you need to do. And so I really had to depend upon my own sort of confidence in moving myself away from this kind of work into a full-time creative life. And this is what this book is about as well. It's not only the other side of art history, and the other side as in, the spirit world, but it's also another side of my life as well, that it was a change in my life that I felt really needed to do. So I've never written so personally as well. So it really does. It starts with me being exhausted in 2021.
How do you find bringing that personal into art criticism? It's something I've been very interested in and have sort of had differing relationships with as well. And at some points my own cultural criticism has been kind of archly and icily impersonal, and at other points it's been, very, very personally inflected. So I think I'll ask you about this, and then we'll go to audience questions for like 10 minutes or so. But yeah. How do you find
well, I mean, this might sound a bit odd because I was editor of Frieze, but I've never really thought of myself so much as a critic. And of course, I commission critics, and there are brilliant critics, and I admire the role of great critics deeply. But I think it was because I came from a background as an artist. I was never particularly interested in, for myself, for writing from a position of, I know what is good or bad, and I will tell you that this is shit, and I'll make them feel terrible about it. I was never interested in that kind of writing. So I've always written from a position of enthusiasm, I think. I was always really interested. Enthusiasm or curiosity or bafflement. I don't know what's going on here. And so I would write about it to try and work it out. And so in a sense, I've always been in my writing. I've always been a deeply personal writer, I think. But this is the first time I've written more deeply about this. And I also go into my family history about my grandfather, who was in the First World War, and was deeply injured in a terrible battle called Fromelles, where 5,000 Australians died in 24 hours. And this is at a time when the population was 1 million, And he came back to Melbourne, and he was really, he was an alcoholic for the rest of his life, and he was a very, very sweet and gentle man. I remember him, he died when I was quite young, but I remember his sweetness, and he wrote a hit song called Smile All the While when he got back to Melbourne, which is, so I wrote about that too, and then bring in ideas around art and conflict and the solace of art and how art can represent moments of crisis, and acknowledge the crisis, but also transcend it or help you find some sort of healing in it. So so I don't think that my book on the spirit world is at all. It's not a critical journey. It's me going, my God, what a strange old world we live in.
Aye.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good time to go to questions. So we can take some questions from the audience. I don't think we've got a roving mic, so you'll just have to project. Yeah.
Hi there, thanks to both of you. It was very informative and interesting to hear about your experiences. I wanted to ask you a question to Juliet, which I apologise for in advance because I realise the subject of this talk is your desire to move away from talking predominantly about trans issues. And I've actually bought your latest book for a few people. I haven't read it myself yet, but I endeavour to do so.
Well, that's quite the leap of faith then.
Yeah. But from my own limited reading on the subject, I was quite surprised to find that two of the most significant figures of the second wave movement, Andrew Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, were, from my understanding, openly trans inclusive. And yet they tend to be two, please correct me if I'm wrong, and yet they seem to be two figures that are unfortunately cited by some, the most unpleasant people to contribute to this discourse.
Yeah, I mean, Dworkin is a bit more complicated, I think. I mean, Dworkin, where she was trans inclusive, I think was quite grudging about it. I mean, I'm not actually that familiar with either of their work, I have to admit. Because, my sort of focus is more sort of cultural criticism than some of the more sort of directly political second wave work. And I've tended to look more at how those ideas have like manifested themselves in mainstream media than in those sort of contemporary 70s like feminist circles. I mean, Dworkin was sort of more antagonistic towards sex work, I think, and that's sort of a line that a lot of like more contemporary feminists working in that certain vein, sort of anti-sex work, feminism tend to sort of cite Dworkin. But yeah, a sort of a subtle or nuanced approach to this issue, such as Dworkin had, is not one that our media is particularly interested in promoting. And I think that's a sort of crucial thing. She's sort of too ambivalent about this issue for a lot of like trans non-binary writers to cite her as a really positive example of like a trans inclusive second wave feminist, and she's not hostile enough in the sort of manner of someone like Janice Raymond or Mary Daly or Sheila Jeffries to really become a kind of hero to the sort of anti-trans like post second wave sort of feminist legacy. So in a very sort of polarized climate that is, sort of created by like a very, very simplistic and quite sensationalistic media culture, figures like McKinnon and Dworkin, I think, do just fall down that gap a bit, really.
I suppose my question was leading to this kind of do you think that the women and these people that do hold these very unpleasant opinions and, these unsympathetic children's authors and such, can they be won back? Is that possible? Is that futile?
I mean,
do you think?
Probably not at this point. A lot of them, I think. They've been basically like radicalised, and a lot of the behaviour is quite cult-like at this point, I think. If you want more on this, there's a good podcast called 10,000 Posts, which is all about the sort of culture of the internet and social media, and particularly like Twitter, and what it's done to people's brains. And they did a good episode on this recently, partly around sort of anti-trans things. She's like a lawyer or something. I haven't followed her too closely because it's just too exhausting. Called Maya Forstater, who was very, very angry about like a library who created a genderless character for children, and she was angry on Twitter about that for like over a week, I think. So they kind of did an episode springing out of this story, and that's a really good explainer of like exactly what this has done to a lot of people's brains, I think. It's British QAnon, basically, is what it is at this point.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Sort of on the back of that question, I'd be interested to know if the way that language works in social media, if you think about the pithiness of Twitter, the kind of truncated sentence structure, and also the way, even in mainstream media, in the broadsheets, how journalism has really become quite anecdotal, and it doesn't seem to have the level of detail or rigour that you look back 30, 40 years ago that it had. And so I wonder, when you were writing, how you think about that, how do you enact a kind of critical leverage against this new type of thinking, this new way that language works, because it kind of, as you say, it affects all of us. And is it even possible?
Well, a lot of my writing is quite anecdotal, and I do, I'm quite upfront about bringing myself into cultural criticism, and writing from personal experience, and that as a trend I think is partly shaped by the fact that the money has fallen out of journalism as an industry, and more rigorous investigative work that is potentially legally might require a lot of fact checking, and also lawyers to defend investigative work. Those budgets are no longer there, and they have been replaced to some extent by people writing more opinion pieces and more personally led pieces, and I think there's a real exhaustion with that type of writing now, both on the part of writers and readers. And again, not surprisingly, a lot of it is sort of commissioned and often written in quite bad faith, I think. So I mean, there's something I'm kind of complicit in, really. I mean, in art criticism, I do want to sort of use art criticism as a way of, and short fiction as well, and memoir, I think, as a way of saying, look, these discourses are much more rich and complicated and varied than they are being presented as. And that's one way around this, is to kind of like refuse the terms of discussion, because, as sort of suggested earlier in the talk and in response to the last question, if the terms being set by the mainstream media are like, you people shouldn't exist and you can justify yourself if you want, but we're not going to listen to you. If you're arguing on those terms, you've already lost, really, and you've lost in a way that is really frustrating and boring. Yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Jacques.
I mean, that's when I read Variations, that was the feeling that I had, that this is such a brilliant riposte, because it's so rich. There are so many different stories, so many different experiences of trans people who come from different ends of the political spectrum, different centuries, different classes. So I think that's a brilliant way to push back against it. Yeah.
And in your work, I mean, you obviously edited Freeze for a long time, and you're working outside of sort of like politics, journalism, and sort of politics publications. But I wonder if, I mean, obviously in terms of bringing far more like female artists to public attention, again, that's an interesting sort of sideways approach to this issue of exclusion, I think.
Yeah, and it was very important to me that the women who I covered in Mirror and the Palette, they weren't the same kind of woman. They weren't all lefty or radical. Some of them are very conservative. Some of them, use a self-portrait for, like Elizabeth Figel-Lebrun, who's best friends with Marie Antoinette. She did self-portraits as a form of a business card, in a way, to promote how brilliant she was. And she was, but she was also very conservative. And then you've got someone like Paula Modersohn-Becker, who sold 2 pictures in her life and lived a wild and rich existence. and wasn't, I think, particularly interested in politics. But in a sense, the patriarchy crushed her in the end. But then there are other women who anyway, there are lots of different women.
So we've got, several questions now. Okay, let's go front to back. So you first.
So the question for Jennifer. I'm just interested to know a little bit more about the sort of role of spirituality in your new book. Something that came to mind as you were talking, and it's probably not what you're covering, but there's a really interesting book that the artist Olivia Plander made quite a while back actually, maybe 15 years ago, where she was looking at female spiritualists and seeing how they kind of used the idea that they were channeling voices from the other side to actually get their very radical kind of anti-capitalist views across by I'm a vessel, you know. So I mean, there's this kind of whole way in which women and spirituality have been kind of entangled in complex and sometimes dodgy ways as well. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of unpack it a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really great observation, and that's one of the big debates raging. You know that it's a few things. Spiritualist groups, under the sort of very broad rubric of the spiritualist church, were actually really accommodating of women, people of colour, people of different classes. So it was one of the few sort of egalitarian movements that was sort of loosely aligned to religion in the 19th century. And that was a real surprise to me, because when I first thought of spiritualist churches, I thought they'd be hokey, you know. But actually it was a lot more interesting than that. And this is one of the big debates that rages. Do women sort of renege on their own responsibility in holding these ideas at a time when they had no agency, political agency, by saying, well, it's not me saying this, it was the Spirit who came through me and I'm just a vessel? Or, you know, at the same time, I don't want to doubt the veracity of their claims, because many of them, especially Georgiana Houghton, who was an extraordinary spiritualist artist in the 1860s, and she wonderfully wrote an autobiography. Because often we all you can do is surmise, you know. But Georgiana Houghton is writing her autobiography, and she says she is so clear that she is communicating with these spirits. Like she had lots and lots of different spirit guides, and she was often in contact, for example, with her nephew who drowned, who she was very close to, and whenever she talked to him, she was damp. Like, you know, and she talks about this as if it's a fact. You know, she doesn't say it's a theory. Yes. She literally would feel the wetness of the water that he drowned in when she talked to him. So, you know, I in a way I have no definitive answer to this. I'm sure some of the women who were interested in spiritualism did feel sort of crushed by the patriarchal structures around them, and so that they used spiritualism as a way of being articulate in a way that they didn't have agency for in their own daily life. But then other women absolutely believed that they were communicating with the dead.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a really fundamental question that around 19th century spiritualism.
I had a question over there, yeah.
Okay, it's a question for Jennifer, and I really like the way in which you spoke about the other side and another side, and obviously, you know, we heard you now that has to do with spiritualism, but you have also mentioned the other side as a space to nurture imagination. And very often when we think about the other side, some people might think of a form of escapism. And I just wanted to speak a bit more about that, because instead it seems to me that this other side illuminates something very important, very real about, you know, this side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great question. Because, I mean, this word escapism is a sort of weird one in a way, isn't it? Because it sort of implies that there's a real world that we live in that is full of facts, and things like art and music, they're not really real, and they're just there as a sort of therapeutic, you know, band-aid. Is that a tautology? In a way, I don't care about escapism. If it's escapism and it makes your life a little bit more bearable, great, you know. So I've always felt that there was a very, you know, that art, music, writing all have a practical application in terms of how we navigate our complicated lives. And so maybe escapism is, I mean, when you think if you're in prison, if you found an escape hatch, that would be very useful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Spent a lot of my morning reading Oscar Wilde's De Profundis.
Right.
Question at the back.
It's a question for both of you, but starting to you, Jennifer. I love the expression that you used, which was full-time creative self. And I know that you've both had to dig deep into your own kind of reserves and kind of fight for your own full-time creative self. So, just in keeping with the nature of these talks, thank you for sharing your journeys, some of your journeys. But do you have any advice for people who are also trying to do that, to achieve their full-time creative self?
It's really hard.
Sorry.
Yeah. And I mean, before I worked at Freeze, to be creative self, my job was as a waitress. I waitressed for more than 10 years. And I always preferred the idea of being a waitress to working in a mind-numbingly dull office job where you had to pretend to be enthusiastic. So do I have advice? God, I don't know. I mean, everyone has to find their own way. But yeah, it's the big question among, all of my friends, and, we're no longer particularly young, but it's this way of trying to work out how to be creative and keep your mind free while paying rent or the mortgage or the, where there's someone to sleep. So it's, this levels of self-belief that are entailed are really, difficult and demanding, and it takes a lot. And, every creative person I know, myself included, have constantly been racked with doubt and fear. We always woke at 3 a.m. with the fear. I can't do this. Why should anyone listen to what I have to say or look at what I have to make? Or, so you have to keep pushing through it. If you really feel the fervour to make these things, you'll find a way of doing it. But it's very difficult. Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit of a downer, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as I was told at my boring office job where I wasn't capable of pretending to be enthusiastic, which is why they kept trying to fire me. I got told, you become a loser when you give up. And that's it. And the nice thing about writing in particular is, it's never over. If you want to be a footballer or something, you have to be on your way to a career by the time you're about 14. Acting, pop music, various other things. These are all, professions where, you need to get into them at a fairly young age. But, there are people who publish their first volumes of poetry or novels or whatever, in their, 70s or 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
So never give up is, just a very obvious but, very fundamental piece of advice. Another really great piece of advice I got was in an interview with one of my favourite contemporary writers, Sheila Hetty, and she was asked by the Paris Review, I think, what's the first bit of advice you give to a young writer? And you always expect it to be something like, write what you know, or, believe in what you do. And she said, keep your overheads low. That's a really good point. I mean, at the time I was living on my own in a flat in East London that I just couldn't afford. And I was working 3 days a week for St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, and then trying to write and do my freelance commissions and my other stuff 3 days a week. And I was completely exhausted. And a room came up in a shared house with a friend, and I halved my living costs at a stroke. And then was able to apply for funding to do a PhD. I was able to write trans and memoirs exactly the way I wanted to write it, rather than having to write a more commercial book. And then I got funding to do the PhD, which then became variations, and because my living costs were quite low, I could afford to live in this flat and, do some freelance journalism and sort of train as a teacher and learn filmmaking as well as writing this book and a lot of the things that are in front lines. And then by the end of that, I was more or less able to make a full-time living out of writing or things related to it. I mean, I should say, I have a one-day-a-week job at the Royal College of Art now, and I do quite a lot of public speaking and sort of freelance teaching, whether that's adult education or at university level. And firstly, there's a few things about that. Firstly, I just really enjoy all of them for their own sake. Secondly, that kind of teaching I teach contemporary art practice at the Royal College, and I teach sort of queer creative writing in a lot of my other like freelance gigs. And this keeps me in touch often with like younger people. You know, I learn as much from them as they do from me. Any kind of interactions I have in these spaces often come with being recommended, you know, contemporary works of art or literature that can help me to refresh my own perspective. And actually, you know, I'm not sure I necessarily want to write full time. You know, writing, like, it's lonely, it's often unrewarding is the wrong word, but you know, it's very slow to reward you. I mean, firstly, just financially, like, you know, notoriously writing pays badly and slowly, but also, you know, just more spiritually, you know, you often don't know exactly what effect your writing is having, who it's reaching, how it's reaching them, what it's doing for them. And, you know, social media can often tell you, but that's often, you know, a quite dispiriting experience. You know, it's one thing to suspect that nobody's reading, it's another thing to have the numbers in front of you. So, you know, I actually quite like having something that gives me a bit of structure, a bit of regularity, and a bit more social contact. And, you know, like, lots of great writers, you know, either at various points in their career or throughout, didn't necessarily write full time. And like T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland while working at a bank. So there are lots of different sort of approaches to this. There's no right way or wrong way to be a writer, I think. You know, the only thing you can control is whether you write and whether you keep going or whether you give up and, you know, what happens then.
And as you say, the good thing is we're not footballers or ballerinas, so we can still do it when we're 90.
I mean, I am a footballer and I am still playing when I'm 40, and everything hurts so much. I cannot convey to you the level of pain I'm feeling in my muscles today after a match yesterday. But, you know, writing doesn't, you know, break your hamstrings. So, yeah, keep doing that.
Thank you. That's great.
Maybe that's...